You're looking at a selfish man's investment. The only person who's ever going to use this is me and my family. And this isn't where you should be putting your attention. He said, look to this. And he looked to the side of that, and there was a little simple rain garden, a little basin he dug in the landscape that was harvesting runoff and growing all this life. He's like, you should be looking at that. That's for everyone. Because that's infiltrating water for me. It's growing food for me, for my livestock, for the wildlife. But it's also recharging the groundwater. It's recharging the river. That's for everyone. And it costs less.
The following is a conversation with Brad Lancaster, one of the most respected figures in the world concerning rainwater harvesting. He's author of the most comprehensive books ever written on the topic, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, Volumes 1 and 2. He began digging ditches in his front yard in the early 90s, then scaled those ideas up to include his quaint Tucson neighborhood, and ultimately has led many large-scale projects and workshops. These efforts have soaked over 50 million gallons of water into desert soil. Brad has demonstrated the power of a single human being when they decide to pick up a shovel and start building. When lawmakers and politicians did not understand what was necessary, Brad built a system, scaled the system, and helped the politicians catch up later. After seeing his TED Talk in 2017, I've spent much of my free time learning more about these concepts and applying them to my suburban home. This journey has changed the way I see the world and how water flows through it. Devastating floods, drought, famine, and runoff pollution can be mitigated if these ideas are scaled. I hope he can open your eyes the way he opened mine. Meet Brad Lancaster. When was the first time you realized water can be stored in the soil if you just give it a chance?
When would that have been? Maybe as a kid. Because I used to play, every time it rained, we had this little ephemeral waterway that was in the front yard, and the water would come through that. And I loved to build these little civilizations, imaginary, of course, kind of sandcastle-like things within the arroyo, and then I'd be waiting for the rain to have a devastating flood. Loved the imaginary devastation. But I saw how the plants responded. And it wasn't an immediate response from the rain. There was this lag time as they're uptaking the moisture that had been banked in the soil. I think that's when I first started to make a connection.
That's relatively rare, and I haven't been able to figure out why that is. Why is that so rare in our society, do you think? I didn't realize that as a kid. It took me till I was in my 20s probably, so maybe I'm just dim, but I feel like a lot of other people don't seem to get that either. So why do you think it is that that's kind of a rare realization in modern society in America?
Well, I think, the realization developed over time, but maybe it's not as common as it once was because we don't spend as much time outdoors. We don't spend as long a time with something. We're so distracted by phones and whatnot that we're not just being in the moment and observing what's going on. Maybe that's part of it. But I think the good news is, such observations are always available to us at any time if we just open up to them.
I think there's a large swath of society where even once they realize the potential benefits of this, they tend to resist the ideas. And the best I can figure is it seems that, I don't know, they don't want to dig holes in their yard because they're afraid someone will twist an ankle. I feel like I heard that one a lot early on when I started kind of digging holes in my yard. But do you have a sense of what that might be, where most people tend to kind of resist that idea even once you kind of put it in front of their face and make it obvious?
I think it's maybe more just the unknown. Maybe the concept isn't unknown, but their experience is unknown because they haven't experienced it yet. So I find the hardest thing for me in any new endeavor is just starting. I fabricate mental barriers. But once I've actually started and I'm in the process, it's so much easier at that point.
After college, you took courses at the Permaculture Dryland Institute in Santa Fe in 1993, 4, and 5. I read a couple things kind of conflicting, but I guess my understanding is some of Bill Mollison's earliest students became the instructors of that institute. Is that correct, or did I misread all that?
Yeah, a number of his students. The reason I laugh is when I first heard of permaculture, it was like permacult. It sounded like a cult to me. And then some folks who were trying to get me to take the course, they're like, "You should do this." I'm like, "Why?" They said, "Oh, it's great info and stuff. I think you'll see the world in a different way. And then you can become a teacher." I'm like, what is this? Some kind of pyramid scheme? Is this like the Amway or the Herbalife of the environmental world? That was my first response. And it didn't seem to be that far off because I then became a teacher of it.
So it was a cult.
In some ways, perhaps. But I found it valuable for me because it had a different perspective than the learnings I'd had prior. And I liked that, at least from the courses I took and my interpretation of it, it strove to seek out solutions rather than just better articulate problems. Not that it's perfect by any means, but I also liked that it seemed to take a number of its cues from the natural world. Or at least those are the ones that I would be drawn to. I wasn't really drawn to so much the solutions people were coming up with, or at least not people in the modern Western world, because I found that the solutions tended to be too resource intensive. It's like buy your way out of the problem, buy your way to the solution. And so what I was really drawn to was like Mr. Zephaniah Piri-Maseko, who I would say was my primary water harvesting mentor. He was a subsistence farmer in the driest region of Zimbabwe who taught himself how to harvest the rain because he had no choice. He was under house arrest for being politically active against at the time, the all-white minority-led government of Rhodesia, because he was striving for democratic reform, so everyone could have a say in their government, regardless of their race, background, ethnicity, or beliefs. So he was literally in ankle chains digging these swales, trying to figure out how was he going to support his family of 8 with no means of income. And he just learned by looking what was happening around him. He saw where the water was too quickly draining off his land and taking the soil and fertility with it. He's like, that's not working. But then he'd see a few spots where there'd be a speed hump in the flow of maybe some rocks or a fallen branch or some remnant vegetation that would slow down that flow of water, get it to spread out a little more and infiltrate a little more. Things are greener there. Things grew better. More insects and stuff came in. There's more life. It's like, all right, well, he maybe didn't know exactly everything that was working, but he's like, something's working there, so I'm gonna try and mimic that. That's available to all of us. And what really inspired me about him is he and his family, just with hand labor, hand tools, converted this eroding land holding into a very productive one. And this might be where I differ from a lot of water harvesters. So a lot of water harvesters go right to the tank. They go right to that consumerist, I'm going to buy something and more things. And I don't like that approach. I think the better approach is to start by, well, how could I harvest the water with what already exists in a way that generates more life? And in a way that doesn't cost me anything. At least doesn't cost more than my time. And Mr. Peary had a tank. And I had more than one, but I asked him about one by his house. And I was asking maybe too many questions, and that he got a little, I don't know if impatient's the word, but I got the sense he's like, you're asking the wrong questions about the wrong thing. And when I asked him to clarify what was going on, he said, you're looking at a selfish man's investment. The only person who's ever going to use this is me and my family. And this isn't where you should be putting your attention. He said, look to this. And he looked to the side of that, and there was a little simple rain garden, a little basin he dug in the landscape that was harvesting runoff and growing all this life. He's like, you should be looking at that. That's for everyone. Because that's infiltrating water for me. It's growing food for me, for my livestock, for the wildlife. but it's also recharging the groundwater. It's recharging the river. That's for everyone, and it costs less. And so that's my focus, is how can I collaborate with the living systems that sustain us? Not how can I buy a new, I don't know, coupling or, jewelry or something to adorn myself and my ego. It's, I think it's a very different approach. And so seeing how accessible that was to he and his family in such harsh conditions, so much harsher than where I found myself, like, wow, well, there's no reason for anyone not to be able to move forward and do better. Mr. Peary, he's the core of my first book. His story is chapter 1, and the principles, the guiding questions, mantras that help focus my thinking process as I'm trying to figure out a site and how to approach working with it. A number of those principles came from him and the folks he was working with, so yeah, he's been very foundational to who and where I am today.
When I've seen you in public talks talk about Mr. Peary, in many ways, your demeanor kind of reminds me of someone like Ram Dass when he's talking about his guru. Do you consider Mr. Peary kind of in any way a guru to you, or is that not kind of the lens you look at it through? Is it just...
I wouldn't say I look at it as a guru, and sometimes people call me a water harvesting guru. And I go, well, what does that mean? So I would say that he was a great teacher and mentor who came into my life at the perfect time. And it was his examples and his questions that really inspired me. So his questions, got me to step back and look at things differently than I was currently looking at. And his example enabled me to see, wait, this is possible. So, like I often share the story that at the end, I only spent a day with him when I first visited him. At the end of that day-long visit, I was frustrated with the water situation back home, and I said to him that I was frustrated and was thinking of leaving, and asked him if he had any advice on where to go. And he very sternly said, you don't go. He said, you go home, you set your roots deeper than you thought possible, and you figure out solutions. Don't run from your problems, because if you run from your problems, they'll follow you, and you'll plant problems everywhere you go. But if you can figure out how to turn those problems into solutions, well, now you've got a skill set you can take anywhere. So that really landed with me. And then I thought, all right, well, I'm going to go home and try and set an example and figure out how we can turn our worsening water situation in a more positive direction. And again, it was through his example, like, look at he and his family, just with hand tools, self-educated, what they were able to do and become leaders in Southern Africa, showing farmers and others what change they could make. Wow, there's real power in that. And that also resonated with, it kept me going years later when I was trying to change city and state policy. So I'd find myself in these meetings with folks that had, degrees in, be it plumbing engineering, be it hydrology. I didn't have any of that. And so I felt like people were looking upon me like, what's this freak doing here? What's his right to be at the table? So my response would be, I harvest water. That's what I do. It's not what I went to college for. Learned this stuff afterward. But I'm speaking from experience. I'm telling you what I know works and what doesn't work through all this. And that gave me a seat at the table where I could be heard, especially as these meetings would go on. And one example, when we were trying to change the gray water harvesting laws, I found that the plumbing engineers kept bringing up their book learning and these systems that don't work. I tried them. They don't work. tank intensive, pump intensive, energy intensive. They stink. They maintenance is insane, and they kept pushing. And I asked, "Why are you pushing this?" And they said, "Because this is the way you do it." I said, "Why is this the way you do it?" "Because that's what the books say. That's what we learned in the books." I'm like, "But have you done it?" And none of them had done it. And they were fighting so hard for this thing they had no experience with. So I said, "Come to my house. Let me show you these systems." And then that's when things started to shift for them. Like, wait a minute, that works? It worked. Well, what happens in this situation? And so then we started talking them through it. And nothing beats experience.
That outlines a very powerful concept that is probably more broadly applicable than just to this topic in particular. It seems as people gain more and more formal knowledge through the standard channels, they learn more and more about less and less, so they're so specialized that they know everything about nothing. And I feel like in that way, what are your thoughts on, my thinking on the word itself has changed over time, but when someone's called an expert, I feel like that's usually meant as a compliment in almost all ways, but there is a downside to that, in my belief. It means that you've narrowed your thinking typically. Now, the question is, how have you narrowed it? Have you narrowed it according to what others have told you is the way, or have you narrowed it because your experience has taught you it's the way, or a bit of both? What does it mean to be an expert?
I don't know. What do you mean by expert? So that's a problem with any term. What does it mean? And it might mean something very different to the person speaking it or the person hearing it. So I think all too often in conversations and in life, we're just assuming we have the same understanding of the term. So I think the first thing is to clarify that. So, sometimes I get called an expert. I don't put much value in the term expert, and I don't put much value in diplomas and whatnot. It's more, I want to see, what are you doing in life, and what is the result. So that's what I look for. And yeah, there's some quote unquote experts out in the world that I look to as mentors and stuff. But it's not because they're an expert. It's because I went to see the work they're doing. I participated in workshops and stuff they were teaching and projects they were implementing, and really learned, wow, this is a different way of doing things than I'd been doing it, and this is very effective. I want to know more. Why is this more effective? What's going on here? And then would go on walks with them and try and learn to see as they were seeing. How do they read the landscape, and how they figured out what went where, and how to modify it based on the flow of water and sediment and so forth.
What does it mean to plant the rain?
So planting the rain it's literally that. Like with a seed, you would create a divot in the soil and then you'd put the seed in that divot. So I'm creating divots, if you will, or depressions, and they can vary depending on the slope, the soil, the topography. There's many different subtypes of divots, I guess, if you will. But I'm basically just trying to make it easier for the water to stick around, to linger longer, and then to infiltrate deeper. And not just the water, but other things, be it organic matter and whatnot, so the fertility can get better as well. So the soil can become more sponge-like as opposed to hardened and drained-like. So then water more quickly infiltrates, but it also takes much longer for it to be lost to evaporation. And this then enables us to reduce drought. So the water lingers longer, so it takes longer for the drought to begin. And then when it finally does rain to break the drought, the water infiltrates much more quickly and much more substantially, thereby ending the drought more earlier. And then you have to think of, well, what's the whole reason for that? So without water, you don't have life. Without water, you don't have sex. Maybe that would get people to listen, okay? Because you've got to have water. for that exchange of nutrients.
As I take a drink.
Yeah. You got to have water to have sperm. You got to have water to have an egg. You got to have water to get those two to come together. You don't want sex without lubrication, so that hurts. So so it's essential that we have that. And what is it of the life that I'm trying to collaborate with or enable to happen? So I guess where I'm kind of going with that little thought is I've really shifted from the plant palette I use. So I used to be enamored with this idea of food forests, but when I'd look at the typical food forest books and permaculture books, it's all about let's bring in plants from somewhere else. It's not looking at, well, what's unique to this place? What evolved over millennia to this place, to these climates, this climate specifically, these soils, this wildlife. And that I find is far more juicy because it's easier to succeed. Plus, the life so much better responds. If I plant an exotic plant here, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll attract a few butterfly species. But oftentimes, I may not be because the native butterfly species haven't adapted to be able to eat. Their caterpillar can't eat those non-native plants. So it's a relative dead zone. And without the caterpillars, without the fleshy larval stage, which is the primary food of birds to feed their young, I'm not going to have the diversity of bird life that I want. So everything's tied in together there. So I'm kind of looping back to what I loved about Mr. Peary is he worked with what was there. He wasn't dependent on bringing stuff in. That's what's so great about our local native ecologies. They're working with what's here. And so I'm trying to do the same on multiple levels because it forces me to get into a practice of trying to have a relationship with place, with what is unique to this place, with what is the essence of this place, as opposed to more of a surface extractive relationship.
A moment ago, you said that when the water soaks in, the drought takes longer to start. I've looked into this stuff enough, and this is a hobby for mine enough, that resonates, and I feel like I have a fairly good understanding of exactly what you mean. But I think it took a lot of mental work or gymnastics or studying to get to a place where that makes intuitive sense. I think when most people hear drought, it means the absence of rain falling out of a cloud for a long time. And that's it. That's the extent of drought. So to your earlier point of how we define these words matters a great deal. So how would you define the word drought?
Well, I think it kind of depends on the context too. So unfortunately, I'm seeing more and more human-induced drought. So getting, say, the same amount of rainfall that we got before, but we're in much worse drought conditions than we were before, in part because we have replaced the sponge-like vegetation and organic matter that used to be on the soil of the watershed with compacted bare soil from which we've removed the vegetation, from which we've removed the organic matter. We don't no longer have those open pore spaces into which water can readily infiltrate. So when we do get rain, we just get a fraction of the amount that used to infiltrate to actually infiltrate. And then since less absorbed and less is available to life, after the rain. So we create a much more impoverished situation. And I mean, I love going into healthy wetlands, going to healthy rivers, and these can be wetlands and rivers in a dryland environment. And it hasn't rained in months. Yet how is it possible that there is this wetland, still very wet, or this flowing river, or this flowing creek, or this flowing spring? It's because of that banked water, when it did rain, it's still within the system. And it's not being released in an instant, but it's this slow release from the soil. So how can we replicate those kind of systems?
What would you say is your first real, in air quotes, project where you kind of were able to perform that?
Well, just here on the property and along the street side. So when we started pulling the water off the street into street-side basins that were lower than the street, the water would we capture more water when it did rain, and then would linger longer. And my neighbors were all coming by and like, how come all your street trees, they're growing much faster than ours, and we don't see you watering? It's like, well, because I'm pulling the water off the street and I'm banking it into the soil here. And perhaps our trees were getting just as much water as those that were watering with the hose, but it was a different quality of water too. So it didn't have the salts that the municipal water had. It had all kinds of beneficial microbes and whatnot, and all the bird droppings or rabbit droppings that were on the street, they came in with the water, so it had a nutrient boost as well. I mean, there's a nutrient boost just from rainfall. So majority of our atmosphere is nitrogen, but it's in a form that plants can't use. But when we have the lightning, thunderstorms, then there's a chemical reaction which converts that nitrogen into a form that plants can use. And then the raindrops bring it right down to the soil and the plants. That's a pretty cool system. Why don't we work with that? So that was one little example where I started to see that. Some other examples where on other people's land was doing some simple water harvesting earthworks, and we created an ephemeral spring where there hadn't been one before. That was really sweet.
I want to get back to that or get to that later on in the conversation, because I feel like that concept is massive and many people misunderstand where an ephemeral spring comes from. But we'll touch on that later on a little bit more. A lot of people, just in my limited experience, the comments in some of my videos, a lot of them are not exactly meant to be constructive criticism, but a lot of like, good luck, bro, you'll never resell your house comes up, and I'm in a position in life where like that wasn't my top priority in the first place, but I felt I was adding value in a way where I'd find a buyer eventually that would understand what I'm doing. And the luxury of YouTube is you could always kind of advertise like, hey world, I did this for a reasonable reason. It's kind of good in a lot of ways, but is that something you battle with at all when you first started to commit to this stuff? Did you consider the resale value of the house?
No.
Right, kindred spirits.
So, well, first off, my brother and I, we were below the poverty line when we bought this house together. We had to buy it together because we couldn't afford a house individually. And the only place we could afford was one that was about to be condemned. So the plumbing was shot, the wiring was shot, roofs full of leaks, all the plaster was peeling, doors were falling off their hinges, windows are falling out of the walls. So we didn't start in a way that put us into massive debt and disempowered ourselves, but rather we got this place because we wanted to create an example of more of what we want to see in the world, and we wanted the chance to be self-taught. Like, how do we figure out how to do this stuff? How do we gain skills in the process? My motivation has always been, how can I create more of what I want to see in the world?
You talk about gaining skills in the process. I mean, where we're talking right now is your lovely garage cottage. I love the portmanteau. Mm-hmm. This is impressive work for anyone. Where did you learn these skills to do all this? Did you pick them up along the way, or how did that evolve?
So, thankfully, my dad loved to scavenge things. And so as kids, we would build forts and stuff out of scavenged materials. So on weekends, we'd go to construction sites, and he'd say, anything in the dumpster's free game. Anything on the ground, like the nails they weren't using, that's free ground. So we're cleaning up the site for him, getting our resources. But we just saw, wow, there's so much available that's free. I think it got us to think more creatively on where do you source things. I think it's really boring just going to the store. There's no story I want to hear about that. That puts me to sleep. But it was more, all right, well, what was the adventure in your finding these materials and then repurposing them for another use? So that was one. then I lucked out in that in junior high I took a drafting class. Very simple, just rulers, protractors, and pencil. But I figured out how to draw to scale, and so I still do the same stuff I learned from that. I just use graph paper, and I saw that that's how my dad figured out how to design and build an addition on our house when I was a kid. So I had that example. But then when it came to more, how do we integrate with the natural world and all, I started to learn that from a permaculture class and the questions that arose, but also going to see ruins. And I love a good ruin. Because, like, what's the story behind that? But I'd go to a lot of the Native American prehistoric sites, like Canyon de Chelly or Chaco Canyon, the Gila cliff dwellings, and see how folks would orient their settlements where they could get the winter sun but would be shaded by the summer sun, and then how they would build in a way that would further build on that foundation. And I would go into these ruins in winter and it'd be cold until I got into the ruin, and then in the ruin it's like, wow, I'm really warm now. And I'd come back on the summer solstice and I'm just sweating like crazy. But then I step into the ruin and now all of a sudden I'm cool. I'm in the shade. Like, well, that worked great then. Why can't that work now? Why isn't that typical practice with our modern building? Why are we always reliant around designing around an HVAC system, a mechanical heating and cooling system? That doesn't make sense to me. I don't know how to make or fix one of those, but I can figure out how to shade in the summer and bring in the sun in the winter. I'm going to go down that path. And I don't even have to go to people for that. I mean, you can look at animals. You can look at, where do your cats and dogs hang out in the winter? They're going to the sun. Where they hang out in the summer, they're going to the shade. So tap into that.
You published Volume 1 of your award-winning book series in 1996. I loved Volume 2 in particular. The graphics alone are worth buying. It's Rainwater Harvesting for Dry Lands and Beyond. I'll put a link down in the description for the audience. You definitely should go to the link and purchase this book. It's life-changing. But I've heard writing a book is a bit like pouring your soul into a time capsule or beating your head against a wall, depending on who you talk to. So what was an experience like for you to create and then publish your first book?
It was tough. But the key thing is I didn't start to write a book. So I started to write an article. That was approachable. And I started by writing a story of my meeting with Mr. Peary. That got me thinking. It got me into the practice. And then I started to shift to writing a book when I realized I was teaching and I was presenting all the time. And I found the frustrating thing to me about that is people wanted so much more information that I can give them in that one workshop or that one presentation. And if they didn't continue to pursue their questions, the interest was potentially going to vaporize. And so I wanted them to have a resource that they could digest in their own time at home as they wanted, and that answered the many questions I had that I was looking to answer. So I went down that journey, and I kept writing articles, many of which were never published, but they're more for me and trying to get to the answers I was seeking. And then, thanks to some great friends that helped me with editing and stuff, started to focus a little more, and it started to become a book. It became the book that I wanted, that I needed, because I was surrounded in my room with stacks and stacks of other books and journals and stuff and articles where there were little bits of the information I was seeking, but they were all scattered through all these various resources. And I just realized, I think there's very few people that are going to be as crazy as me to try and sift through all this to get to the information they want. I've got to create something where it's much more accessible, it's much easier to get to that information, and appeals to a broader audience. So that's what I sought out to do, and it took years.
Well, thank you for sticking with it, because I feel like it's been a great service to my personal life and to society. When you did that, I mean, that's kind of, I don't know, you were already teaching by then, so it's not necessarily step one of stepping into the public arena, but it certainly is a big step further into that arena. Did you find yourself, are you an extrovert by nature, I guess is what I'm kind of driving toward?
No way. No, I'm very much an introvert. So even after just this interview, I'm going to balance my blood sugar, and I'm just going to hide under the covers for a little while and just crash.
Now I feel guilty.
No, it's just the life of an introvert. You can't get around that. So I step up to the role that I see is needed. So in high school, I learned that because I took a drama class, and I realized, oh, if I step into a role, I can act in a way I would not act otherwise. And I was so beaten down and uninspired in much of my learning, in public education. And it doesn't matter that it was public, could have been private. But I had a rebellious streak. It's like, well, if I'm going to start teaching, I don't want to bore others. So how can I teach in a way that might excite or inspire others? And I drew on the few teachers that actually did do that for me. And then I tried to do the same within my writing. And I can perhaps thank in part, especially my dad, who was a storyteller at dinner every night. And how can I also bring storytelling to teaching, to writing? Yeah.
It seems that served you well, because I would consider you, and this isn't me just attempting to flatter you, but you are a good communicator. And I work with students in some form, and that's not universal. It's not like education guarantees you'll be good at communication. Is there any advice you could give to younger people listening to this as far as, is theater the way? Are there other ways? But do you consider that your golden ticket to becoming a good communicator, or do you think, was it innate?
Well, it's part of it, but I think being a good listener is key. And not only listener of others, but of yourself. So what is it you're really trying to learn here? What is it you're really trying to understand? And focus on that. Dive into that. This is also helpful for me when I'm in a setting where I'm not interested in the topic, seemingly. It's like, well, then I start looking for, well, there must be something in here that could be of interest, or maybe I can apply to a different context that I do have some interest in. So it becomes a game that way. And then I'm trying to do that when I'm interfacing with people. Like, what sparks them, or what might spark them if they don't look sparked currently? And try and find more a universal that will, cross between the divide between us.
When I first bought my house, my plan was to get rid of the lawn and in its place do the standard kind of landscape fabric on top of, where I was, the lawn was dead because I didn't maintain it very well. So just landscape fabric on top of dirt, which, that already means that you're starting at the top of the soil. And then I was going to add large river rocks on top of that. And in my view, this was the way to not use water on a lawn, because it seemed like consumption of water for the purpose of a lawn equals bad. Not that that has necessarily changed, but how do you feel about that kind of cookie cutter approach to using less water? Landscape fabric, rocks, leave it alone.
I don't like it because it doesn't inspire me. In fact, it kind of scares me. I see a lot of folks that are implementing what they think is a good water harvesting system because they maybe have seen a photo somewhere or something where they'll do that little rock-lined water channel going from their roof downspout unfortunately, to the street too often. And what I don't like about it is it's not going to maximize a positive benefit. It seems to be trying to minimize a negative impact. I don't like low impact camping because it also bores me. It's good, if you're gonna take out what you pack in. Okay, that's good. But I got inspired when I got into primitive skills, like how do you make fire with sticks, and how do you trap, and how you find what are the edible plants in the wild, that kind of thing. So I did a course with the Boulder Outdoor Survival School in Boulder, Utah, and Dave Westcott, he had been leading that school for a while, and he started us, we're all gathered before we walk off into the wilderness and start learning. And he said two things. He said, one, I want you to be the ghost of the desert. I want you to go out there, and I want nobody to know that you were ever there. Have that light a footprint. He said, but I also want you to have a very heavy footprint. So how can you go forth, and how can you be and act in a way that things get better? And that really resonated with me. So what we would do there in that instance, if we would have a fire, we would have a fire with twigs, not logs. So we're actually helping be part of the decomposition process, and we're not cutting stuff from trees. And then we would make sure that if there's any charcoal or coals, left at the end, we'd grind it all up into powder. And then we would disperse it, and we would mix it in with the soil and seed and other organic matter. So nobody could find a fire ring. Nobody could find trace of fire. But we were actually helping boost the fertility of the land. And also the way we would, you wouldn't crap in a bag and then bring that home. Our crap was a gift to the landscape. Same thing with our urine. So, do a cat hole in a way that you are enhancing the fertility of the area, and don't just leave a turd under a rock. Make a little fertility stew, mix in seed and other organic matter and whatnot, so that you could come back to the sites where we'd camped, a couple of years later, and there'd be more life growing because of the way we had turned our human wastes into a giving resource, and the seeds that had germinated within our fertility packets and the life that had grown. That was the sweet stuff.
Yeah.
And so I was frustrated early on when I wanted to make a positive difference here, because the majority of the book said bring in the landscape fabric, just bring in the rocks, just remove the lawn and so forth. But I would continue to be asking myself, how could we really make this better in a way that creates a beneficial ruin? So in a way that I could abandon that, I could walk away from it, but it's going to keep getting better year after year.
A beneficial ruin. I love that term. I'd never heard that. I feel like there's this constant most people, I believe, probably are trying to do good. I know there's some outliers, I'm sure, sociopaths and whatnot, but they probably are acting based on whatever their lens is, and that a lot of times leads to bad outcomes. But most people seem like they think they're doing the right thing, even if a lot of people don't agree. I think a lot of people can become paralyzed. So when you're trying to do good, in air quotes, you could minimize the bad, or you could maximize the good, or both. But a beneficial ruin, I think that's beautiful, because it really is. You will alter the landscape in some way, no matter what. Breathing, some CO2 is coming out of us, and I've seen people paralyzed by the fear that they're making things worse by living, and there's a healthy balance there, to limit the amount of damage. But I found that people that are trying to maximize the good, then they feel empowered to go forward and do so, and that's inspiring instead of paralyzing and depressing. But I think both parts are necessary. So
Well, I think there's a real key thing in that we can do a lot of harm by doing good. So just look at colonialism and whatnot. Like, oh, well, the native peoples don't know what's right. We know what's right. So let's eradicate them. Let's eradicate their culture. Let's eradicate this knowledge of how to be in relationship with what is unique to this place. And let's bring in a new religion or whatever, a new way of practice and being. So I think a key thing we need to be asking ourselves all the time is, am I really doing good? How would I know? And I need to try and have a practice of how do I see what I'm not seeing? The practice of looking for that which I'm not looking at. To have the perspective which I don't currently have the perspective of. To be more open in that sense. And I liked one thing that I heard Alan Savory say in an interview is he asked, how would you know you're wrong? It's a great question to ask. Like, how would you know you're wrong?
Right. I mean, I don't mean to derail you, but I moved me to tears when I first saw him speak. It was also I saw you on TED for the first time, saw him on TED. He was talking about the story of how all the elephants they shot, and how at the time he was so fully convinced that this was the way, the land needs this, we're saving the land, we must do this, and it was, the necessary evil. And then he realized years later that it was just backwards, and he meant so well, and he almost started crying when he was talking about it. So those are powerful words. How do you know if you're wrong? It's not always easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Back to rainwater, the less heavy subject of rainwater. Within your 8 principles of water harvesting, number 5 is to always plan an overflow. Speaking of being wrong, is there a painful story behind number 5? Or did you think of that in advance, or did something go really off the rails and then you worked that into number 5?
Well, a lot of the principles, and there's more than just those 8. So in the new full color edition of Volume 2, I have a whole nother principle set for in-channel water harvesting, like in ephemeral waterways and so forth. And I have a whole nother principle set for gray water. They've all arisen in part from as a means to remind me, hey, don't forget to look at this time. It's something I didn't fully consider and made a mistake. So, for example, made a water harvesting strategy that overflowed to a neighbor and flooded their yard unintentionally. It's like, okay, I don't want to repeat that mistake.
Was your neighbor angry?
Surprised. And they made it very clear they didn't want that to happen again. So I made sure it wouldn't. Thankfully, there was no significant damage done. It just flooded their yard. So that principle expanded a little bit more. It's not just always have an overflow, but always use the overflow as a resource. So it's that whole bit, because that then is meant to try and shift our thinking. So rather than just I have to have an overflow, but let's use it in a way that generates more resources. So I can have a safe overflow that won't flood my neighbor, and won't flood me, but is it really doing the most it could do? And that's why I added that other piece. So a principle is doing better when it's a means to get us to look at what we're not looking at.
Also on the topic of mistakes, we all make them, nobody likes them. Ideally, our mistakes, though, will lead us to learn at least as much as we suffered. With that in mind, what's the biggest mistake in your life that you're comfortable sharing, and how does that mistake look now that it's behind you?
I don't know if this is the biggest, but in the very early days when I started doing this work, I was really cheap, because I'd do a napkin drawing concept, and then people would pay me labor wages to implement it and be learning as I went. And the mistake I made with one is this guy was just really pushing me to do work on a real steep slope he had in his backyard. And I didn't feel comfortable doing it. But he just really pushed, and I desperately needed money at the time. So I took it on and tried to do a good job. But I never went back, but I have a feeling that thing failed.
Was it terraces or just
but it wasn't well-built terraces. I hadn't figured that out back then. I was still figuring that out. And he didn't want to invest in the amount of rock it would take to do it right, nor the amount of time. So he was pushing me to do it quick and cheap. And that was not appropriate for that site. And also, I don't think we should ever get stuck on a certain strategy. It didn't have to be rock terrace walls, retaining walls. It could have been vegetation. It could have been a seeding project. There's many different ways to come upon the same problem, trying to address that problem. And now I'm much more cautious in what I accept, the jobs I take, and I'm better at communicating to folks. If I am not comfortable with something, I say, hey, I really don't know. My confidence is low with this. Here's one potential route we could take. So it's not just bottled in me. We're having this conversation like, well, we could bring others in too to, flesh this out, and I think more heads thinking about it, the better.
Yeah. I heard once that the mark of a good surgeon is knowing when to not do surgery, and I feel like similar concept. Knowing which jobs to turn down goes a long way when it comes to safety. If we could linger on the topic of terraces, for the audience, just so you don't have to stop and Google it, a terrace, you may summarize it differently than me, but a terrace is basically a step-like structure, often built into a sloped landscape or the side of a hill or mountain. I'm always fascinated by ancient sites like Machu Picchu or Sacsayhuaman. They have these unthinkably large terraces, although the scale isn't necessarily big, but the individual terraces are massive. And then the stones within them, especially Sacsayhuaman, some are estimated to be as much as 100 tons. You mentioned that you've always, kind of a streak of archaeology interest in you, liking to visit ruins. Do you ever ponder how ancient people were able to build structures like that?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What do you think? I think mainstream archaeology tells us the world is, or the ancient world is one such way. I have a hard time squaring that, though, with the things they put forth in this super primitive technology. It just seems like either magic or impossible that's how they did it. But what do you think? Do you ever give any credence to these kind of alternative views of history?
Well, I don't think it's primitive technology. I think it's advanced. It's just not using modern tools. So just observing how the seasonally changing path of the sun is, you can get incredibly accurate orientations to the sun for passive cooling and heating, much more accurate than if you use a compass. And some of those I go into in the Appendix 7 of my first book, of how you can just use a stick in the ground and watching the shadow. That stuff's really accessible for us all. But I think it was the care and the time that they just put into observing and learning from that. That's what I think is so amazing. And I don't know if this is going in the direction you want, but I'll just say with the rock work of some of the ancient terracing and stuff I see, it's incredibly good rock work. Like yes. the bad rock work, you don't see it because it doesn't last.
Right.
So the same thing applies today. And so one of colleagues, Craig Sponholtz with Watershed Artisans, I love his work. because for me, it's some of the most beautiful rock work, and thus it's the most durable rock work. It oftentimes doesn't look human built, and he's so careful in the way he lays the rock one into the other that this can handle massive flows of water. And I see some installations of others. It's very quick work. It's ugly work. And it does not hold up. So I think the more we can be craftspeople, we can be artisans that are both artisans with working with natural flows, say, of water and sediment, but also the specific materials themselves in a way that they function at a much higher level and that they're much more beautiful. That's the sweet stuff. I mean, that's so juicy for me. And so I aspire to that. And I have demolished and rebuilt many of my early projects. Because in the early days, I didn't have that eye. I didn't have maybe the same aim, and I didn't have the same skills. But as I gained that over time, I came back and said, okay, I got to redo these. And I really had to, because every time I walked by them, I'd get a pain in my gut, like, it just sucks. So then redid it and now love it. Like, okay, yeah, this is good. This feels right.
Worthwhile correction that primitive and high tech are not often used in the correct way, because as you astutely pointed out, we have a lot of technology today, but I can't find north. You know what I mean? I have a very poor intuitive sense of that, and that's definitely not how it used to be in the old times, clearly from the structures they built and the stonework and everything else. I always just stop and just get stuck on the size of the stones. Do you ever ponder if there's any chance that they poured them or something? How did they move them? Do you get that much thought? Or?
Yeah, I'll give thought to that too. But then it's great to go hang out with some crews in rural Mexico and see how they're moving stuff. And they're just masters at leverage. Yeah. Because all they have is a digging bar, right? Really, and they don't have machinery. Right. And to see what they're able to do, it's great. Yeah. So good.
No, simple machines. In more recent history, buffalo roamed North America and beavers built dams. I understand that both were keystone species for water infiltration. I think the dams are probably more intuitive for most people listening to this than the buffalo necessarily, but is there anything you can share about either of the impact of those animals, what both of their impacts were?
Well, the amount of beaver that there used to be throughout North America, throughout the world, it's just a tiny fraction today of what it once was. And I think they were the ultimate of how to slow spread and infiltrate the flow of water. But I think when early Europeans came in, maybe they didn't like that there'd be so many marshes and whatnot. They couldn't see the value of that, but did see a value in the fur for fancy hats or whatnot. And we lost the stewards that kept up the beaver dams and would rebuild them. So things started to dry out. Okay, that's talking through my understanding of history. Let me speak to maybe more real life experience. So there's a stretch of the San Pedro River, which is here in southern Arizona. And I used to go to this one reach, which would dry out at certain times of the year. But then some beaver colonized that reach, built some beaver dams, and now it never dries out. There's always water. And when I say always water, I don't mean just water behind the dam. There's water also leaking through their dam. They're leaky dams. So they've brought perennial flow to a reach of the river that only had ephemeral flow. And that's super powerful. With So I don't have as much experience with the buffalo, so maybe I won't comment on them as much.
It only came to my mind. I'd never even heard of this till kind of recently when I was brushing up for this. I saw the imprinting machinery in Volume 2, and it was mentioned that this, in some ways, it's a modern mimicry of hoof prints, large stampedes that used to roam, the North American plains that are now gone. And I think once you really start going outside in the rain and just looking at how it behaves, the puddles and such small indentations are gone before most people step outside with their raincoat on. And so I think most people miss that, but it really is in a time where there were trees being tipped over by the wind and the root ball would uproot a mound of dirt and leave a divot next to it. Over just untouched millennia, the world had moguls everywhere, and within the moguls there were moguls, and I just can't help but ponder what that must have been like before we flatscaped everything, because water really would, at scale, land and stay instead of shooting out to the oceans again. But within the context of how we live now, is there a way to scale either replacing the animals or mimicking their impact? Is your work a path into that, or do you think that there are limitations to the techniques that you apply?
Well, I'm definitely trying to mimic, but I think far better is when I can collaborate. So I don't want to create the need for me to always be there. It comes back to the idea of the beneficial ruin. So the more species I can collaborate with, so they can continue to steward and evolve the system, the better. So I might start by trying to mimic an animal or whatnot. Like maybe I'll start by creating a beaver analog structure to start to stabilize an eroding waterway. But it's my hope that will be overtaken by a beaver who will create a new structure. And maybe not in the exact same spot, maybe elsewhere. I think that's a better way to go, because it also then might help us get our ego out of the way and think we can do it all. I don't think we'll ever reach the potential going at things alone that we could going at things in a collaborative manner with many life forms.
Even for me, and I like this stuff and I look into it, it's a hard topic to really wrap your mind around, is that animals can do work for, I wouldn't even say for us, but us being the planet, not humans necessarily even, but like beasts of burden style, but beyond that, for a city kid growing up, you don't think about mowing your lawn with a goat, but it's like if you're out in agricultural land, farmer, you do think of it that way, and it's like you're putting animals to work, but it's not even just for the farmer necessarily, it's for the system, and it's like, yeah, these creatures had a job to do and they do it very well. It's just that we kind of change the way they interface with the world. Similar topic, I understand there's something called a one rock dam, and that they can literally change the course of a river. Can you tell us how that works?
Sure. So first off, let me just say the way I use one rock dams is not in rivers, not perennially flowing waterways. So I use them in ephemeral flowing waterways. It's one rock, it's more than one rock, it's only one rock high. I learned this from Bill Zeedyke, who wrote, along with Van Clothier, the book Let the Water Do the Work. They're basically human-built riffles. What's a riffle? So if you're ever on a river trip and you're on your raft or whatnot in nice, calm, flat water, you're going over a pool, okay? And then all of a sudden you hear the noise of there's some roughness up ahead, and then you start to see the white water, and there's a rapid. Well, the rapids are where you've left the pool and you're now going down the riffle. So you build a one rock dam at the very top of an existing riffle. Sometimes you don't see those riffles if you haven't trained your eye in an ephemeral waterway, because as the water flow slows at the end of a storm and the end of a flow event, it starts to drop more fine material, and that can disappear in a way. The larger aggregate, the rock riffle that's there, it's just now covered with some fines. So I learned, thanks to Bill and others, how to see these riffles. And then my building of one rock dams became far more effective because I wasn't randomly placing them. I was actually placing them where a natural riffle already was. And I was just adding to it, adding a little bit elevation to it to then increase the depth of the upstream pool and the water retention. And even if it fills up with sediment at the end of a flow event, there's still moisture being held within that sediment.
So I stopped by, I'm already blanking on its name, mountainside, lots of saguaros.
Was that at Tumamoc?
Yes,
something?
thank you.
Okay.
Yep, sorry. Shows my knowledge of the area. But yeah, I stopped off and saw one of your local one rock dams there. I believe it was one of y'all's works. Yeah, fascinating. It makes me want to... I live near a green belt, and I have a neighbor across the drainage way from me, and I started to play with these ideas. Unfortunately, he lives at an inherently low spot in just the entire neighborhood that is prone to his cul-de-sac going underwater. And when it got close to doing so, he thought it was due to my one rock dam, which was 6 feet drop down from him 150 feet away. But he was of the belief that it would build up sediment, which would eventually lead to impaired flow, 6 feet uphill and 150 feet away, which I'm not going to argue with him. So I took it down. But yeah, fascinating structures. Someday, if I'm lucky enough to have more of a chunk of land to play with, I definitely will focus on that. I guess kind of on a similar topic, speaking of scaling these ideas, so I have this hypothetical daydream where I imagine, what if every suburbanite, instead of all the effort they put into their lawn, what if they put that into rainwater harvesting earthworks like berms and basins, and then that would help suburbia. But then what if you expand from there? You expand that to the more rural areas, ranch owners and farmers. Instead of clearing brush and tilling soil, what if they did the same? Berms and swales on contour, and then every raindrop falling on their land would just stay there. And then this is probably going to be unpopular in lots of circles, but even national parks and state parks, I think if you, the beneficial ruin idea, if you apply it that way, this is we hope, how do you know if you're doing right? But maybe it would be worth it to alter the landscape to some degree if it meant infiltrating water, I think the wildlife and the plants would probably appreciate it. Do you dream of these scenarios, or does it just seem too far-fetched? You're focusing more on what can we do today, or do you fantasize about a world where that might be?
Yeah, no, I'll fantasize about that, but not stuck on strategies. So it's more, what is the desired effect? So my desired effect is not more swales, more one rock dams, more strategies. It's a healthier, more vibrant, more productive, life-giving world. So I hold that as the aim. I'm not stuck on the instrument, the perceived way I have to go about it, but just because then I'm closed to other options. So so often on ranches and whatnot, yeah, we can put in structures, but really what makes way more of a difference is changing the land management, just changing the grazing practice. So instead of the cattle always on a section of land, always eating the vegetation down to the ground, if instead be rotating them and moving them so that the land has a chance to recover, the vegetation can come up. So then the grasses, they become the living water harvesting strategy. We don't do any earthworks. Yeah, it's more what's the desired effect we're going for here. If that's just more of a healthier living sponge, is maybe one way I'd look at it.
It seems there's probably a future, I don't know when, where humanoid robots may be among us in force, and labor would be more affordable if that's the case, possibly. So the claims go anyway. I imagine that technology and working on earthworks, given the vein of what you just said, that's much less interesting then, because there were animals on this planet for a long time that were doing it anyway. Why reinvent the wheel in a very exotic manner? Am I fair in my assertion that that's kind of where you go with it? Like,
Yeah, well, I'd also say that a lot of the damage to our ecosystems got so much worse when backhoes and bulldozers became available. Because then it's like, oh, I got this idea. I can do stuff now. I can get much more immediate result, and I don't get tired because I'm just moving some pedals and a hand lever. And you're not getting that feedback loop. I mean, getting tired, that is part of the feedback loop. And I think a bulldozer's not getting feedback. It's not a living thing. The robot's not getting feedback. So if we start harming the living system, that's going to start harming us. And I think we've created with technology too many ways of not seeing the harm or not experiencing it as readily. And so, nor the benefits. I don't know if I'm being clear here in how I'm talking this out, but in a local ecotone, a local ecosystem that's healthy, all these various life forms, be it insect, mammal, fish, birds, whatnot, plant, fungal, bacteria, they all create checks and balances on one another that lead to their evolution. And we seem to be so focused on trying to eliminate these checks and balances. Like, how can I do more faster? How can I get rid of the limits? And I think that's really hurting us.
On July 4th weekend in 2025, Central Texas went through a 1,000-year flood event. Our local rivers rose 30 feet in 90 minutes, and at least 135 lives were lost. And the financial cost of that, not the lives, but the financial cost alone was estimated to be $20 billion. It's tempting for me to fantasize that with that much money, if you were to instead invest it into rainwater harvesting earthworks, could we truly mitigate flood events like that?
So I don't mean to be harsh, but that 1,000-year flood event, that was a 1,000-year flood event. Harvest event.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, as I see what you're saying from the context of the water.
Yeah. And so I think we can start by just changing our perspective. And so by helping the landscapes be more absorbent, we're going to dramatically reduce the amount of runoff contributing to downstream flooding. But at the same time, a big part of this is you got to stop building in floodplains. Got to stop channelizing the rivers and the waterways. Instead, let them do what they do naturally, to spread out, to meander, to be able to absorb those flood flows rather than rifle them faster downstream. So we have to come at it from multiple angles and perspectives. And anytime we have a catastrophe like that or problem, hey, that's an opportunity to shift how we're doing things.
If we could get to a point where so much more of the water was soaked in to the land instead of getting into the rivers, I came under fire in a lot of my comments on some of my simplistic earthworks, if you even call them that, but that I'm robbing water from the river. And I feel like, to me, that I remember thinking like that before, but then now I've changed quite a bit with all the stuff I've looked into. So can you expand on the concept of what would actually happen if every raindrop soaked into the land? Would the rivers run dry? Because there are a lot of people that think they would.
No, the rivers would run much more healthily. So again, If you go hang out by a river and it hasn't rained in months, how is it possible that river's flowing? Okay, so you shift from very rapid on top of the surface flow of water, like if you've got just compact earth, to a much longer, slower flow of water that's infiltrated, that's moving through the pore spaces in the soil and whatnot, and it's a much slower release. That is a much more resilient flow that will flow much longer into the dry times, and it won't be anywhere near as destructive in the wet times. The other advantages of that, instead of having hot, polluted water going into the waterway, you have clean, cool water that's so much more beneficial for fish and other aquatic life. And that's going to be feeding springs as well. It's going to be feeding the groundwater table. So I hear that that freak out comment all the time from people, but it comes from a lack of understanding of the system as a whole, I think.
Yeah, I think on a global scale, to simplify it, and this is an oversimplification, but there's kind of either ocean or land, and the fresh water on land is really delivered there by the atmosphere, and that was ocean just a while ago. So the land can either act as a chute that immediately returns the water to the ocean, or the land can act as a sponge that slowly releases the water back to the ocean over time. And then all of the waterways are full because of that. So on that topic of the sponge, what is meant by the term the soil carbon sponge?
Mm-hmm. So by having a soil that's full of life, be it roots, be it various organisms that are constantly creating more channels into the soil, lessening its compaction, water can much more readily infiltrate. Not just water, but nutrients and whatnot. There can be much more exchange of all kinds of things. So it's sponge-like, and it becomes much more absorbent. And then as we grow more organic matter, it can hold on to that moisture longer. So that's another sponge analogy with that. But so much of this life that's burrowing through and that's creating the organic matter, it's carbon-based. Okay? So the more life there is, the more carbon we have within that soil. So it's not just a water sponge, it's a carbon sponge. The sponge, it's not just a sponge alone, it's also a pump. It's a living pump. So the vegetation is able to pull water into the soil through its roots. And a number of our desert trees here have this ability to do hydrologic redistribution, where they absorb the water in their shallow surface roots in the times of plenty, and then they move the water through their root zone to their very deep tap roots. So that water is stored where it can't be lost to evaporation, much deeper in the soil profile. And then the dry times, it brings it back up to the surface roots, creating a more humid, beneficial microclimate under the canopy of the tree, which also helps other life under the canopy of the tree. That's why you see so much more diversity and density of life in the dryland environment beneath the canopy of a tree, a bush, even a cactus, than you do out in the open. These trees then, or the other vegetation, whatnot, it's also then evapotranspiring moisture back into the atmosphere, cloud seeding again. Not just cloud seeding in the form of moisture, but also because there's beneficial bacteria in the stomata of the leaves and whatnot that can go airborne. And it's the perfect shape and whatnot around which moisture can condense. So this bacteria, it'll arise with the air currents way up into the highest levels of the atmosphere, and then the moisture in the atmosphere can condense around those and start to form clouds, and it rains down again. So yes, the oceans are a major driver in our precipitation, but so is the land and these living pumps, these living sponges within the land. And when we remove or lessen those sponges on the land, we dramatically reduce our rain cycles.
So with a functional soil carbon sponge, Earlier you were saying that the drought doesn't start until the groundwater or soil water is been used up. I mean, and in some ways that would imply that it's not necessarily fully dependent on the frequency of rain. But then ironically, in this context, the soil carbon sponge, when functioning and plants living within it, leads to more rain. So not only when you soak in water does the moisture stick around and therefore drought isn't occurring yet, but also the moisture sticking around begets more moisture, because when plants grow, plants concede rain. So instead of the main way of most people looking at it, rain begets plant. In some ways, plant begets rain, and I think that's not as commonly known. So what are we doing to disrupt the soil carbon sponge at scale?
Well, let me first say one thing. So we've got a finite amount of fresh water on this planet. So the key is, how do we make it go further? And we can't make more of it, but we can cycle it more and more times. We can use it more and more times in a way that makes it more usable. That's the key. So how do we go down that path? But all too often, the way we're doing stuff is we're extracting water in a way where we're then worsening the quality of that water, and we kick it off a landscape much more quickly, so that it can't cycle. So I think that's an essential piece of it. And now I got to ask you to ask your question again, because I just got stuck in my own answer.
Ironically, I was just saying that in many ways that plants begets rain.
Yeah.
And I think that's not well understood. But as you were talking, it actually, I'll admit to the world that I'm frustrated at the number of times I've heard it, because it seems obvious once you make a puddle. But I guess two-part thought, one of them kind of being a question. But I have a lot of puddles in my yard, and everyone, all of my family, half of my comments are, you're going to get malaria, you're going to breed mosquitoes, Zika, everything's coming for you. And I did, in the opening scene of one of my videos, I did a time lapse showing one of the, I call them soaking pits just because I'm a simple man, but one of my basins was infiltrating the water. I did a time lapse watching it go from full to disappear. It took maybe an hour, and you can literally see the plants perk up as the sun comes out. Just incredible. I thought it spoke for itself still. Even though that's the opening scene, I get so many comments about mosquitoes. So what can you say to comfort those out there about mosquitoes in these soaking structures that you build?
Yeah. Well, I think your video does a great job. Let's look a little bit more closely at a mosquito. So what does a mosquito need to make more mosquitoes? So a mosquito, one of the species we have here, it needs at least 3 days of standing water to go from egg to adult. If it doesn't have 3 days, you're not going to have any more adult mosquitoes. It can't get there. So what you found with your puddles that infiltrate the water in a matter of hours, that does not contribute to mosquitoes. Now, you might get mosquitoes that are already in the area hanging out because they see, oh, here's a puddle, here's where I can breed. They might lay some eggs in that, okay? But those eggs are going to go nowhere. It's just going to add to organic matter in the system and food for other life.
More carbon for the sponge.
Yeah, exactly. I think when people get freaked out, whether or not they'll go there, that's an opportunity to learn more, to ask more questions. Like, well, what's really going on here? How could I work with this? So I just found that we just got to make sure we don't have water standing for more than 3 days.
Has that been hard for you at all?
No.
I think that's the part that most people don't understand. I think so many people are used to man-made or human-made materials like a sidewalk or pavement or plastic buckets or tires when they're stacked. And in their mind, oh, well, if you get water in that, it's going to stay there for at least a week. But there's this absolute lack of understanding that it's like, no, a puddle in dirt doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. And it's mind-blowing, the number of people that lack that intuition. I don't know why. I guess we're my theory is that most people that grow up with the good fortune to have an opportunity to put feet on soil. I understand city dwellers in apartments and high rises can't be helped, but if you grow up with a yard, you have the opportunity to walk around barefoot in the dirt. You're set up for failure the moment you buy or rent the house, because everything is a dome. There are no puddles, and it seems our society has literally forgotten what puddles actually are, and there's just no intuitive understanding that mosquitoes aren't a problem in a dirt-based puddle. They think of cement and asphalt.
Yeah, and I just want to say too, okay, it's also fine to create a puddle that lasts weeks, months, years, but it's a different system. So the systems I mainly design, install, and advocate in my books, they're ephemeral puddles not lasting for more than 3 days before the water is infiltrated. But a great many ponds are not generators of mosquitoes either, if they have a healthy ecosystem of life within it, and you've got the predators of the mosquitoes. So, yeah, there's...
Don't fear the puddles.
Don't fear the puddles. Don't fear the water. You are water. You're 70% water. Yeah. And as you get older, you're less. So we're 90% water when we're babies. And most of our life we're 70%. And then when we're near death, we're really dehydrating. So death is just a slow form of dehydration.
Yeah. I'll drink to that.
Yeah.
What is a curb cut versus a curb core? I know we spent the day looking at the difference, but for the listeners of this episode, they may not have taken the time to watch the full video, which I encourage you to do so on Suburban Biology. But what's the difference? Curb cut versus curb core. What are those things?
Well, I'll first say what they both are is they're a means of bringing street runoff off the street into street side water harvesting basins lower than the street. So before curb cut or curb core, you had a concrete curb that was acting like the Berlin Wall between the waterway, the street, and the floodplain, the public right-of-way that's higher than the, typically higher than the street, and kept away from it by that concrete curb. So curb cut is you're basically cutting out a section of the curb to allow storm water into that street side basin. Curb core, instead of cutting out a section, you're drilling out a section. So are you cutting or drilling? I'd say they're both cutting. And the curb core tends to be circular, whereas the curb cut tends to be more trapezoidal in shape. The curb cut is often a larger void space, so it can move more water more quickly in a shorter period of time than a curb core, but tends to take a little more time and energy to make a curb cut, so it tends to be more expensive. But they're really just different sub-strategies of the same strategy.
After having some time to go around town and see your property today, I realize most of your techniques that will pull water from the street into this, as you said, floodplain and soak it in, a lot of them don't. It could just be the nature of elevation, like you just said, that the land tends to be above the street. But if there were the opportunity, were a street at a high point and a large piece of land sloping downhill, have you done any projects where you bring water in from the street, flow it through the land, and then have a spillway at the low point to get rid of it in a safe manner? Have you done that, or would you do that?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
On all counts, as I've seen you've done through your video. So
well,
yeah.
I used a pump. I cheated. I was lazy. I mean, for anyone who's seen that video, I will just disclaim, I actually made two systems. One of them was gravity fed and did work. By the nature of the way my street is set up, the 1.0 version was on a curb that flowed much less water because it's only fed by a short street, whereas the right angle bend gains me access to half the neighborhood. And so the volume of water on the other curb is insane. And when I pulled it in there, to get it to a point where it would actually start to flow under gravity alone, I'd have to dig a trench that was far deeper. And at the time, it was a mixture of laziness and conservatism. But I figured there might be people out there that are more inclined to set up a pump. But I hear you. I think there's far more logic in building a system where if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, it still works. I don't have to explain to my wife how to work on the wiring and plug it in, circuit breakers. So.
Well, and the key too is that principle of always have an overflow and make sure you use it as a resource. So you never want to do something in a way that's gonna create a liability for others. So yeah, as long as you're covering that, you're good. And it used to be you could not do that in Tucson. You could only harvest water from public streets within the public right of way. But that law has now changed too. So now you can harvest water coming off a public street on a private property as long as you're not causing any flooding problem for any adjoining neighbors.
I understand that you were largely instrumental in getting that law changed. In fact, when you did your first curb cuts, the law was not on your side at that time, and you kept it quiet for a while. What was that process like, outing yourself to, I don't know if this is not meant to be derogatory term, it's meant to be generic, but to the regulators or bodies that care, what was it like outing yourself? What was that process like?
I was pretty scared because I had very few financial resources available to me at the time, and I was concerned I might be fined or worse. And I couldn't afford that, and I didn't want that to be imposed on my brother either. Wouldn't be fair. But ultimately the fear was of the unknown. It was perceived problems that had never happened. Okay. And that's, I find, where the bulk of my fear is in the world. It's of imagined.
Catastrophizing.
Not what is. So I didn't approach the city anywhere near as early as I could have. But what in some ways gave me the will to do so is more and more of my neighbors saying they wanted to do what I was doing. And I knew that would be illegal for them. So I thought, well, we got to change the law. And then approached some friends within the city. So I think the way to start to change things is look for the friendly allies or potential allies. So just ask them, how might we go about this? And who else might we approach within the system? And so then strategize together. And friend Ann Audrey, she worked for what at the time was the city sustainability department. So she facilitated the first meetings. And she was instrumental too in bringing in some other potential allies, along with folks that were definitely resistant or against it. And that was instrumental because when many of the traffic engineers started bringing up big complaints and saying you can't have water near a road base based on what they'd learned in their school and whatnot and had in their textbooks. Frank Sousa, who was at the time the head of the flood control department, he had brought a whole bunch of photos to the meeting that showed these unconscious curb cuts, curb cores throughout the city where street runoff was unintentionally being harvested in street side depressions. And they'd been there decades. And there was no problem to the streets. And so what were these examples? It's maybe where a street curb never got completed, or maybe there'd been a car accident that busted out some of the infrastructure, but it never gotten repaired. These kind of things. And so what diffused the fear of the theoretical understanding was the evidence of the real life example. And that really dropped a lot of the fear threshold. Also, what helped is we weren't the first to do this. So the cities of Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon were doing this, but that was being pushed by the city staff. Whereas what I was doing and others started to do in Tucson, it was the citizens pushing for it. So I was able to direct city staff to Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon staff. So engineers could talk to engineers and speak the same language in that sense, and that helped a lot too.
In the lucky event that anyone ever hears this who's working within the city, infrastructure at some city that's not doing this yet, do you have any advice for that individual as far as where to begin the process of trying to bring about more logical ideas when it comes to rainwater use or management?
Yeah. So share good looking, good working examples from elsewhere. It's better though if they can be a similar climate, soil type, and give them resources. I mean, I found we got so much more traction in making change once I had published my first book, and then even more after my second book, because it was referenced to, people could see where I got my data and whatnot. And that was something that a lot of the policymakers could just read at home, not being challenged by the public, and slowly digest. That really helped a lot too. And it enabled them, a number of them, to do little experiments at home and see for themselves. And do pilot projects. Again, you got to let people see it, experience it.
I'm sure I'm going to get some heat for this, but I think that over time my idea of the concept of regulation has probably changed. I did a little bit of interfacing with the city when I was starting down this path, and I realized that it wasn't on the books to be allowed to do this. There was no path forward, and I'll admit I took a lazy way out in some ways, and I just did it. So I never really asked for permission. I asked, like, how illegal is this, and I got an answer of, well, we don't really know, and I was like, good enough, and went forward. But I think I have a lot of friends that anytime regulation is under fire in any way, sometimes people assume that's bad, but it's particularly for my friends that would probably self-identify under the term environmentalist. I think a lot of them tend to assume regulation is pretty much a good thing. I feel like, in my experience, it feels like a sword that cuts both ways. I think it can certainly be a good thing, but I don't know. What has your experience been? Is it that simple? Is regulation a good thing, or does it just depend on the regulation? Because
depends on so many things, the context and all. So everything can be good or bad, or blurred between. So I'm really glad that the city of Tucson has a rainwater harvesting rebate and a gray water harvesting rebate, for example. You don't have to do any of it. It's volunteer to participate in the program. But I find the application process quite the headache at times. And I think they could get more people participating in the program if it were designed more for those applying as opposed to those reviewing. So I think that's a big problem with regulation. Oftentimes, is it's designed to work better for the regulator as opposed to those dealing with the regulations. And I think that has to flip. So if you look at our more, I don't know, I think Apple, did a good job by creating more intuitive computers in the early days. So it lessened that friction. Okay. And from what I understand, Steve Jobs was really pushing for, this is not about the engineers. When the engineers complain about how difficult it was to make that computer easier for the people to use, but he just kept pushing, no, this is for the people using it. I think that's how we need to approach regulation. And we need to constantly evolve it. So we have a commercial water harvesting ordinance here in Tucson where at least 50% of the commercial property's landscape water needs to be met by passively harvested rainwater. And great to have the regulation, but for over 10 years it was a failed system because it wasn't being reviewed properly, it wasn't being inspected properly. So I got hired by the city to do an assessment of the ordinance, and that led to some changes, but we still got to do more. I just met with one of the city council members last week, to see how we can further improve the ordinance so it's more effective. It actually does what we want it to do. So here's the frustrating part about it, regulation. It's never just one step and you're done. It's take a step and keep taking steps and stay engaged. I thought when we first started getting some successes in this that, oh yeah, done now. And then I realized, nope, this is life work. And then I realized, oh man, it's multi-lives work. It's multi-generational work. And, but then when you realize that, it's fine. You just, it changes maybe your expectations, and it changes your approach so you can be more effective.
Yep. I feel like I probably started this journey in regards to water maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, largely because of you. Thank you for that. Yeah, and now I'm 41, and I'm starting to realize this is multi-generational. It's funny how as we get older, you start to look at your life with a new perspective and your small place in the big cosmic game. Kind of on that topic, to pull on that thread a bit, being part of a bigger thing. I got a lot of comments when I first made my rainwater tank that seemed kind of angry. I don't know if it was directed at me, maybe Texas. I don't blame people, but angry comments saying that if you vote for the right people, this wouldn't be an issue. And my opinion and intuition is I'd prefer to pick up a shovel, because I feel like it's kind of like the regulation topic or pre-legal things. Sometimes the best way for it, if you want to ensure a good future, go build it, and then don't break laws flagrantly. I would never recommend that, but like, I just feel like if I had to pick up a shovel or vote, sure, I'll do both. But still, I think picking up the shovel is a better way forward. You break a sweat, you feel better, you're connected to the dirt and the world, and you have some real life experience instead of just a degree. But that's me. Do you have anything interesting that you could say on your beliefs on some? Is it more important to vote or to pick up a shovel sometimes?
I think it's more important to engage, however you do that. And I love picking up a shovel because that, and then using that shovel, and then seeing the result, and then changing my approach or tweaking it as I see what happens and how things could be better, because that's giving me a life experience of what is the value, what is the positives, the challenges of this, and that can better inform my votes, because I have a better understanding of the larger system. So I do feel that this backyard and neighborhood street side water harvesting and all, for me, that's very much an action to change water policy, because I then have a better understanding of just how water flows, how water works. Whether or not I ever get into a position where I'm making water policy decisions or change on, more of, say, be it a government level or whatnot, if I can do it in a way that is hopefully getting those that are in those positions to better understand it, while at the same time getting the general public to better understand so that they can make more educated votes as to who are in those positions.
Yeah, my gut is, when you're young, if you can, pick up a shovel. You can vote later. You can vote then, but you'll be a more informed voter, like you said. I think that's, I see it the same way. Another criticism I sometimes get, so when pulling rainwater from the street into your yard, there's risk of concentrating some pollution. I've done some lab analysis on my soil, video coming soon, but it's incomplete so far. But thus far, I've actually found that I have less of some pollutants than as compared to my neighbor who uses just the standard city water, which in our case is Edwards Aquifer water. So does that surprise you that I have less of some pollutants in my yard when I pull all that street water through it?
No, in that, but I'm making an assumption when I say no. No, because I'm also assuming you've got more life in your soil. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But it looked quite lively in your video.
Sloppy, you can say it.
No, no, lively. I mean, I saw a lot of life there. So that, and it also it jives with what I see happening here and that we're doing. So the more of that street runoff I harvest, the more life I see grow, and I don't see any of that life suffering. And then, thanks to Mitch Pavlo-Zuckerman and other researchers at the university who've come in and done soil tests and whatnot, they see that no, it's not a problem. And if we start getting more heavy metals, if we start getting more petroleum, then the soil microorganisms that interface with that, use it, sequester it, eat it, they go up. Those populations go up. It's a living system, so it's responding to what's coming in. So we find that we're actually boosting the natural filtration, the bioremediation. And then, but the other key thing is with the research that he and others have done, is we're finding that you've got much greater numbers of these beneficial microorganisms when you've also got other things that support them. So instead of mulching with gravel or rock, you're mulching with organic matter, which creates better living substrate and whatnot for those organisms and habitat. So you can with more information, you can better collaborate with these other life forms.
For again, I guess to caveat for the listener, the systems I've seen today largely are kind of sequestered near the sidewalk, and there is an entire concept to the idea of it is better for the globe to pull pollutants from the street, put them through a bioremediation filter rather than shoot them into a creek where the fish have to breathe this stuff in. But if there's an individual like myself pulling it through their entire yard at scale, have you ever toyed with the idea of a sort of first flush system, or does that just seem too difficult or impractical to implement in any way?
Well, I do have a first flush system. It's the first basin closest to the inlet off the street.
Yeah.
And all the life within it.
You're making me feel bad because I'm in the process of making this entire video, and it took me about 3 or 4 months to wrap my mind around the results I was seeing. And I realized, you know what? I don't think all of my soil through all of my yard would have the same results. I think it's extremely likely that the first basin, it would have different results from the later basins. But no.
And you're going to find different life in that basin over time as it responds to the different conditions.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's a cliche phrase of the American dream. What do those words mean to you? What is the American dream?
Well, that's going to depend on who's doing the dreaming and who's using the term. So I guess really the only thing I can answer to that is what would be the American dream for me. And I would say, well, not that I always recognized it as the dream or as the reality or as something I could lose, is being able to get information, true information that I could act on through books, through media, through learning, and also to have the freedom that I could experiment and practice, and in a way that I wouldn't be jailed, but could actually interface with the, be it government officials or whatnot, who could have perhaps jailed me, but instead chose to work with me to see, well, could we collectively create a better system here? Could we shift things? That's been amazing. I have had the opportunity to teach and learn in other areas where folks felt less free. And you could feel it. that, yeah, that's what I fear. We could lose that, and I see examples in different contexts where we are. So I'm trying, yeah, to keep the dream alive that we can work collectively, and more consciously in a way that lifts the potential for everyone. I mean, every person, whatever their belief background, but every life form. Because we're, yeah, we depend on each other whether we recognize it or not. I don't know if that's where you're going with the
No,
question.
that's great. Yeah, that's you actually summarized. So I asked this. I hope to ask this for a while. We'll see if I ever get a big viewership on this sub channel. But I asked this of my last guest, and you summarized basically kind of how I summarized it in many ways. I used to be annoyed with the idea. My stereotype of the American dream was this little cartoon mental picture of a white picket fence, an overwatered lawn in a dry climate. It's impractical. Nitrogen fertilizer, insecticides broadly applied, like all this stuff. I would just gag at the idea of the American dream just because that's the cartoon I had in mind. But through time, that is entirely not how I think of the American dream. And I think you summarized it well. I feel like I feel fortunate and blessed that I was able to break some rules at my yard and it paid off. I was able to find your information on the internet, which, you know, it can be a scary place and there's some downsides to it, but man, it's also pretty great. Like I got to kind of meet you before you ever met me. And I learned so much from you through a TED talk and then found out about your books. So the access to information, the ability to bend some rules and not get the book thrown at you, that is kind of what has become in my mind the American dream now instead. And so now I have a very positive reaction when I hear that phrase instead of being annoyed for people overwatering their yards. So, but not that the world's perfect. I think there's work to be done. And I think it's always healthy to keep in mind that you may lose the thing you love so much because it helps prevent losing it, hopefully, to some degree. It doesn't fully drift off the edge of a cliff if you always keep in mind that it could be lost, you know? The technology flywheel seems to be speeding up. Many people are starting to question what the future will look like given the changes in our monetary system, AI, robotics, formal education, you name it. For young people out there trying to figure out how to plan for the next 30 years of life, what advice would you give them?
I would say try and gain as many experiences as you can, lived experiences. The more of that I was able to do, the more confidence grew in me, and the more I was willing to do. I lucked out perhaps in some ways, and maybe got limited in some ways. In that, my father would hold court every evening when we'd have dinner as a family, and tell these amazing stories. Mom would too, but Dad was the dominant storyteller. Though I got many great stories from Mom as well, but we'd be watching the news, and he'd say, "Oh, I've been there. I've been there too. Countries all over the world." Or some leader would come up. He said, "Oh, I met him," because Dad was a journalist for a little while. It kind of closed me up a little bit in that I was like, God, I am never going to have those kind of experiences. I don't even know how one gets those experiences. But what it did do is it really instilled in me a desire to have my own stories. Not Dad's stories. He had his. I didn't know how to go into that world. But I wanted to have mine, and I wanted them to be stories that I wanted to tell. And that became a motivator. So, like, one thing is, I think it was my 21st birthday, I said to my brother, "Hey, let's go skydiving." And so we didn't tell anyone else. We just went. And I hate heights. It's just, horrific fear of heights. But it's like, well, I got to do this because I'm so scared of it. And I should have a parachute as long as it works. But more than anything, I'm gonna have a story. not that you got to do anything, but anyhow, so that was one example, but then there were many others. And I would do things that I otherwise would not have done. And then over time, it shifted to, well, I really want to learn more about this, or I want to have some agency in this. And so that started to shift more of the adventures. So like my brother and I, we train hopped from Tucson to the Bay Area. But the train hopping, that was just an excuse, a means to get to the Bay Area, where I knew I could hang out with this guy, Brock Dahlman, at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, and could brainstorm more around water management and water ideas. So the train hopping was a means to get there, but it also started to build the story, which grew the larger story, which was the creation of the book, and then my growing vocation for myself by seeking out others I could cross-pollinate with and collaborate with that also seemed to be pushing bounds in their own way, in their specific context that differed from mine, but yet maybe the overriding aim was the same or similar.
A lot of wisdom in that, I think. I've heard others say having agency is one of the keys to happiness, and I think those words resonated, and hearing you say that reminded me that I've heard that elsewhere too, and I don't even remember where, and that it makes all the difference. The belief that you have the ability to change your destiny to some degree. And I'm not saying that everyone necessarily has that as much as others, but in some ways we all have the option to look at it that way. And then at least to have a story to tell. This is a part of a larger road trip. I'm honored you took the time to talk with me, but before I left, a friend was saying, well, at least you have a story to tell. And so even if it all goes wrong, you'll have a story to tell. So also very brilliant. Thank you for sharing. Let's say 100 years from now. So in my mind, your legacy is already secured. I feel like my hardware is running your software and has some of it. I'm not saying I'm a clone of you, but your good ideas got into my head about a decade ago, and I've been working pretty hard to further them without ever having met you. So in my view, that's already a pretty interesting legacy to have such an impact over just my life. But what do you want 100 years from now? What would the ideal legacy that you leave behind? What would that be?
Well, I don't know, because I'm still living it. And so I guess where I'm trying to get at with that is there's some strategies, like in the first edition of my first book, that you won't find in the book anymore. I've taken them out, and I've learned from others like Bill Zedike and others, there's actually more effective strategies. And also the work I'm doing is shifting, or maybe what's sparking it is shifting. So initially, I wanted to harvest water so I'd have water in case the water system went down. And now the new thing that's kind of perking in my mind is, well, how do I create neighborhood firefly gardens in a community where they no longer exist, but they were here historically? And how can these firefly gardens be also food gardens, pollinator gardens? How can they be the flood control system? It's just, it's another in. It's just that the fireflies are what's sparking me currently. And how can I use them as a teacher to get me to go beyond my current approach? So I don't know. I don't know if that's like a bit of a tangent, but I just find I'm always changing. And maybe this is a hope for 100 years from now, is that people don't get stuck. Because I've definitely frozen when I've wanted to act, when I've just been really frustrated about how the situation currently is. But due to self-generated fears or whatnot, I haven't acted. And it's led to a number of years of just real frustration and agony until finally I did actually act and move through that. And that's so good and so rewarding. I think we need to push through the difficult, because then we learn how to push through the difficult. And it may have nothing to do with water harvesting. There's so many other different ways in on that. But how can we be a contributing species on this planet to all the other species and the essence of what makes this planet so unique in this universe?
That's a great way to wrap things up. Thank you so much for showing me your lovely home. It's been just such an honor to meet you and to talk with you, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for helping spread the word and whatever it is I'm saying.
My pleasure. Spread the software.
Yeah.
After a long, enlightening day, I said goodbye to Brad. Despite being tired, I continued my journey up the West Coast into the evening. As the computer in my car ferried me down a darkening highway, my mind returned to what Brad said about technology and feedback. The damage made possible when tireless machines magnify imperfect ideas to the scale of the Dust Bowl. For most of human history, each generation lived like the one before it, through vast periods of technological stability. But then come the leaps, when tomorrow no longer resembles yesterday. We are on the cusp of one such leap. Autonomous machines will become idea magnifiers at a scale that's hard to conceive. The earliest tasks we assign these machines will shape our path for generations. I hope we set goals more noble than lawns. With some thought and foresight, our future might contain rehydrated landscapes and thriving ecosystems. But that can only happen if the people dreaming of that future are willing to build it. To support Brad Lancaster, please check out his YouTube channel in the description. To support this channel, please share this video with someone who would enjoy it. Clicking the thumbs up makes YouTube spread the word. Subscribing helps me spread the word. I'll see you on the next one.